psychedelics, the synthetic plant-based, and we're going to talk a little bit about the preparation that's necessary for some of them, and contraindications, and state of mind, and answer all your questions. And in case you don't know me, let me explain a little bit about how I got into psychedelics when I was in elementary school. Oddly enough, there was an accidental, I guess, deposit of a book in the school library called Flowering Plants that looked innocuous enough. And in my opinion, it was innocuous, but it was about Datura and Henbane and ayahuasca and morning glories and all of these different psychedelics. And for I was just really fascinated with consciousness and sort of metaphysics, I guess, even as a very small child. And so that was the first like real studying, I guess, I did. And I was probably only in maybe third grade, but I was a very advanced kid, so I was reading at a pretty advanced level by then. So that began my journey with psychedelic medicine. And so in junior high school, I came across Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna and the Psychedelics Encyclopedia, and I devoured all that stuff. I read the Psychedelics Encyclopedia um, three times between seventh and eighth grade, I guess, maybe seventh and ninth grade. And so I still, have a pretty encyclopedic knowledge of all the plants and the chemicals involved and their effects. And um, as sort of, I guess, related multidisciplinary studies, right? Because I was always really interested in metaphysics and philosophy and all that stuff. So I also started studying, physics and psychology and world religions and different spiritual practices from around the world, and even occult practices in the Western tradition in probably junior high school, and Huxley and all of that stuff. And so in the last 10 years or so, I've been able to add to that a lot of the research that has been done in regards to psychedelics and psychoactive plants. And really, it's just a matter of confirming what we already knew, but it is helpful to have this additional information because we're finally really starting to understand how psychedelics work. And most importantly, we're starting to be able to explain and the machinations, the mechanisms that facilitate these almost unbelievably efficacious treatment potentials that psychedelic medicine represents. I think one of the difficulties, aside from stigma, that we're facing as a collective is that a lot of the advocates sound like they're evangelizing to an unreasonable, creating unreasonable expectations. And the reality is that it's difficult to paint a picture that really exaggerates the capacities of psychedelics to reverse a lot of neurological conditions. And one of the biggest misconceptions about psychedelics is that in the 1960s, when the researchers were commissioned by the United States government to investigate their medical applications, and the CIA was doing a lot of experiments as early as the 30s. Um, so the misconception is that that the researchers told the government that the psychedelics were very dangerous and that they should be outlawed, and that actually isn't the case. It has nothing to do with the influx of drugs into the Haight-Ashbury, like crystal meth and heroin. A lot of people think that's what happened, that the association of different drugs actually soured the reputation of psychedelics. And that's not the case either. What actually happened is that the researchers concluded and sent their conclusions to the government, saying that psychedelic medicine could treat, in the words of Dr. Humphrey Osmond, could probably treat every known neurological aberration. and oftentimes in a single treatment. That sentiment has been echoed recently by a researcher at Johns Hopkins University. His name is escaping me at the moment. It's not difficult to Google this quote, though. He said basically the same thing, but maybe even a little bit more dramatic. He said it is simply unprecedented in the history of psychiatry that a single medicine can do what psychedelics can do for so many different applications, and oftentimes with a single dose. And you have to remember that if you're comparing, your observations of your friends taking acid and still being drug addicts or whatever the case may be, that this is, it's assumed that these compounds are being used in a controlled environment. And by controlled, I don't necessarily mean that there are licensed therapists or doctors with lab coats on, but that the person has been prepared, that the person is truly dedicated to affecting whatever kind of change they're consuming these plants or synthetics. So the intention has to be there, and the process needs to be well understood. And there are different types of processes that are very effective at enabling people to beat addictions. I was able to quit smoking with a single moderate, I think about 60 to 80 micrograms of LSD. Um, in only about 2 hours, I was able to quit a lifelong cigarette habit. And it was so effective at rewiring my brain that I actually had forgotten completely that I smoked until I found my pouch of tobacco in my pocket at like 7 o'clock p.m. the next day. And, that means I went the entire day with no nick fits, no withdrawal. It didn't even occur to me that I smoked, not even once. Like I said, it wasn't until I found my cigarettes. And this is a common experience. It's not like it's something that's unique to me. The research shows that 85% more cigarette smokers are successful when they use psilocybin as an adjunct to other therapies. I don't know what is meant by other therapies, but the bullet point of that presentation is that without psilocybin, people are 85% less likely to quit smoking. And so, now we understand the neurological basis, the physiological basis, why it is that psychedelics are able to do what they do and to free people from PTSD and from addiction and from, all sorts of neuropathy and pathological conditions and trauma-based issues. And the marvelous thing about psychedelics is that they all there is overlap in terms of application, right? So LSD is good for things that psilocybin is good for, and ketamine can do some of the things that both of them, So all of the psychedelics, all of the indole ring psychedelics, and the phenethylamines like MDMA and well, I mean that's the only one that anyone really uses. Mescaline is actually in the same family. Um, even though they're from a different class, they still can be used for everything that the entire group of entheogenic medicines can be used for. But some are more effective at certain things than others. And so, for example, psilocybin actually has the ability to repair damaged brain cells to the extent that it's being used right now, or they're trying to, they're, what do you call it, clinical trials to attempt to resuscitate brain dead people, people who have had such severe brain damage that they are comatose and they're unexpected to ever awaken. But they're thinking that because psilocybin can actually rejuvenate those brain cells, that they may actually be able to wake these people back up. And it is the only, not just medicine, but it's the only circumstance that has ever been observed in medicine where these shriveled and damaged brain cells are able to be resuscitated. Psilocybin is the only thing known to science that can do this. So it really is a truly remarkable compound. All of these compounds are. And so for learning enhancement, for example, and expansion of creativity, LSD actually turns out to be the most efficacious at catalyzing neurogenesis and enhancing neuroplasticity, both in situ and in vitro. So in the brain and in a petri dish, LSD actually causes more new neurons to grow more new neural pathways than any of the other compounds. And so, and I know a lot of plant medicine people have this prejudice against anything that's created in a laboratory, but that's actually not sensible. I think that this idea that everything that mankind does to nature is inevitably going to be a Pandora's box sort of catastrophe is a kind of toxic ideology. And LSD, in my opinion, is proof that mankind can actually collaborate with nature and produce something amazing. When it comes to microdosing and tolerance, I'm not really sure what the thinking is. My experience with microdosing is that microdosing does nothing, and research actually concurs with that. There's no difference between true microdoses and placebo-controlled group, several different studies. And I think people fail to understand what placebo means. Mind over matter, right? Your consciousness directs the brain. So it is possible to actually experience healing, like genuine healing, even from sometimes things as dramatic as cancer with only placebo. In fact, big pharma's clinical threshold for efficacy is that the medicine in question can be 10% less effective than the placebo. So the placebo, say it's effective 40% of the time, the medicine they're looking to approve only needs to be effective 30% of the time. So it's really quite a remarkable thing what the brain can do. But in my opinion, what you need to do is find the threshold dose where you're barely having any psychoactive effect, but you know that you took it. And for me, I think that that is a much more surefire way to ensure that you, I'm aware of Juliana Q, but I, I think she actually did a video about the studies regarding microdosing, and that it really isn't. At least there's no, scientific or clinical reason to think that it does anything. There's no evidence. No, I mean, every study I've seen, they say that microdosing doesn't. If you use a control group and compare it to a placebo, there was no significant difference in several different studies. So again, you're going to see a lot of different studies out there, but a lot of the studies are going to be studies that were paid for by what are the big, pharmaceutical Med, and so if you trace the paperwork back, you're going to find that the studies are funded by people that are selling microdosing and other pharmacological stuff. And also, you have to specify what is meant by microdosing. If we're talking about truly sub-threshold doses, then there's no difference between that and the placebo in hundreds of test subjects. So, but I think that if you increase it just to the threshold dose, you will see some pretty dramatic. In fact, it's assured because of what is happening in the brain. The healing of these shriveled brain cells. What happens if you're a long-time alcoholic, and I'm sure this also happens with methamphetamine and any of these toxic drugs, is that the brain cells sort of shrivel up and curl. And this is bad for a couple of reasons, because your brain is physical space, right? And so if you are growing new neural pathways, they need to have freedom of movement. And this is why the stamets stack, for example, has niacin, because it actually trims that stuff and kind of dissolves it off the ends, the shriveled ends of your neurons, kind of like when you cut your split ends out of your hair. And then the neurogenesis is catalyzed a lot by the lion's mane, which is of course non-psychoactive, but it's so good at restoring brain health that it's being used without pharmacological or pharmaceutical adjuncts to treat Alzheimer's. So the stamets stack, and this is something you can just make, has a little bit of psilocybin. There's another psilocybin analog that they use, and then niacin and lion's mane. So okay, so far, a quick recap. If you're trying to learn, or you're trying to enhance your intelligence or expand creativity, then at least on a neurophysiological basis, LSD is going to be the most efficacious. I also like LSD for activities and like playing guitar and doing creative things because there isn't a lot of body load. So you're very fluid and still able to, after you develop your acid muscles, is how we spoke about it in California. It becomes, you can do everything that you normally do, but a little bit better. And this really surprises people, but it's kind of like a unspoken. Well, people know, right? But the X Games athletes, it's kind of standard. Instead of steroids, they'll actually use about 100 micrograms of LSD because your balance is enhanced so much, and just your overall, your senses are faster. You have more subtle connection to your perception. Edges are more well defined. And again, we're talking about a barely psychoactive dose if you're experienced. For some people that may be more sensitive, 100 micrograms might be a strong-ish dose, but for me, it's almost nothing. I would have to, pay attention to even know that I had taken it. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about performance enhancement with psychedelics. And LSD is definitely the one to go to for that. And so psilocybin, if you have had problems with alcoholism or drug addiction or depression, even taking non-psychoactive doses is going to help you to regenerate your brain. This is, of course, really, really important because one of the reasons for, when you have addiction, you have the acute withdrawal phase, which is when you're like, if it's an opiate, you're thrashing around and you can't sleep for days and your muscles are twitching and maybe you're vomiting, all of this stuff is going on. And then after that, you have post-acute withdrawal, which is generally depression and soreness and all of this kind of stuff. And so, of all of the major psychedelics, psilocybin is going to be the one that is going to help you bring your brain physically back up to par so that it can regain homeostasis and start to function normally again and alleviate depression. And also, it's worth noting that psilocybin taken on its own is probably not going to be as efficacious as a microdosing supplement or as a medicine for healing the brain because there's a very complex relationship going on with the various alkaloids that are found in the mushroom. And it's not as simple as just psilocybin. There's psilocin, psilocybin, baeocystin, which has unknown medical applications, but I think that it's under-researched and that we need to take a good hard look at it because it's suspected to be responsible for a very strange phenomena that occurs when you eat. I think the only ones I've ever heard of it happening in association with are the azarescens that grow around Astoria, Washington, on the peninsula, basically, and the surrounding areas, and not much anywhere else. Columbia River Gorge, they grow. Um, if you ever get a chance, the peninsula in Washington is amazing. It's covered in azarescens. I mean, the right time of year, the beaches, the dunes are just absolutely blanketed in them. People's yards are full of cyanescens. The cow fields are full of liberty caps. There are 52 species of psilocybe, and 23 of them are psychoactive. And then on top of that, all of the good gourmet, like the what do you call it? Flagarics. It's not a good gourmet one unless you cook it. By the way, if you boil them thoroughly, they're not psychoactive or poisonous. But chanterelles and boletes and all of that kind of stuff grow prolifically. It's an amazing peninsula for mushroom hunters. Um, but so this baeocystin actually causes this paralysis, and I didn't know about it the first time that I picked azarescens. I picked a bunch in the woods and we ate them. And towards the end of the night, I was eating a banana and suddenly my jaw didn't work anymore. Like it wouldn't do anything, and my tongue either. And so I had to use my hand to make my jaw chew. And it was pretty scary because I didn't know what was happening, and I didn't associate it with the mushrooms. I've eaten mushrooms a million times, and nothing like that had ever happened. In fact, once I had eaten azarescens. Somebody bought them at a Grateful Dead concert in 1995, right before Garcia died, and but we didn't need as many, just a couple little caps. And so the next day, we went for a walk, and as I'm walking down the trail, my leg stops working, like completely stops working. No amount of will or sending any kind of message to that leg would get it to do anything. So it was just totally useless. And so I had the wherewithal to Google it, Azarescent paralysis, and it turns out that it is a well-known thing. And I immediately, because I knew that baeocystin only occurs in significant amounts in a couple of mushrooms. One of them is, I think, the bog canosabe, that actually contains. Oh, wait. There's a psilocybe baeocystis. So that one, and then maybe the bog canosabe, which interestingly, there is actually a mushroom that has both the amanita toxins and psilocybin and psilocin. So that's kind of crazy. I've never eaten them. But so what I'm saying is that I'm sure that this paralysis-inducing compound has some medical use. It absolutely has to. And again, I don't know if I mentioned, but I apologize about the sound quality. My brand new microphone is not holding a charge for some reason, so I have to get another one, but we'll have the sound quality back up to par soon. Okay, so there's one other thing about psilocybin mushrooms that we all should know. Oh, actually, there's a couple things. I became convinced that my psyllium was conscious many years ago. I was growing mushrooms, and I had a cake in my well, I had a lot of cakes. Uh, we ate some, and I picked up the cake, and I swore I felt it get hot and kind of tremble. And so, without saying a word, I handed it to my girlfriend, and immediately she's like, "Oh my God." And so I thought, well, we both experienced that. And then a couple of weeks ago, Paul Stamets announced that they have actually tested mycelium and it's conscious. So that says a couple of things. It says that consciousness does not originate in the brain because you do not have a brain in mycelium, although I would kind of think that mycelium sort of is a brain of sorts. But at any rate, technically, no brain, and it's able to solve mazes, and it's able to navigate spirals, spiral recognition. I'm not really sure what that entails. So interesting side note, but sticking to the medical applications, Harmala alkaloids were recently determined to occur in various strains of psilocybe mushrooms and probably others. And that's an interesting development because the chemical was it 5-phosphoryloxy dimethyltryptamine. It's very similar to an N-dimethyltryptamine, right? And structure, almost identical. All of this stuff is very close to serotonin too, by the way, which is a whole nother topic to get into. Sorry, I'm just looking at the comments a little bit. The thing about salvia, Shane, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. I don't want to get too crazy all over the place. Maybe I'll just come back to the comments at some point. But shamans say, Mexican shamans say that you have to grow the plant yourself and develop a relationship with it, and then it's not so terrifying. And this is why people almost always have negative experiences with salvia, except for the truly twisted ones out there. But okay, so the Harmala alkaloids may actually contribute to the psychoactivity of psilocybin, and it has been noted by people that it's very different when you take it alone. And in case you're not familiar, Harmala alkaloids are the alkaloids that are present in the ayahuasca vine and the Syrian rue that facilitate the action of DMT, and they themselves are catalyzed and become psychoactive with the addition of DMT. So to find them existing together in nature in the mushroom is interesting, and they're all different ratios for different species. So if you decide or discover that Harmala alkaloids are something that you need, and they have a whole host of applications aside from their association with ayahuasca. which is interesting as well. But if you know which ones you need, you can actually use this information to choose the best strain of psilocybin mushroom. And you know, in my experience and the experience of many other people, different types of mushrooms have different accompanying nausea, precipitate different levels of nausea, and there are some that don't really have the body load that is associated with them. So it's definitely, all mushrooms are not created equally, and our biochemistry and physiology is different from individual to individual. So it is really, really advisable that if you're using psilocybin for whatever means, that you experiment with some different strains. If you have a negative experience with a particular type, it may be a good idea to try another, because there are all sorts of chemical compounds in there, and there hasn't been enough research in terms of analysis, I think, to really even be sure what all they are. But one of the other reasons that psilocybin is so beneficial is that the heart, well, not psilocybin, excuse me, eating the full mushroom, right? Like whole food. I know there's a word for this, it's escaping me, but um, eating the whole mushroom, not taking extracted or synthesized psilocybin, because the harmalas are actually very, very strong anti-inflammatory, anti-inflammatories, and they also will have um, that the same anti-inflammatory properties in the brain. And I think that neuroinflammation is probably under recognized, underdiagnosed, and underrated issue that probably more people suffer from than realize it. And so, any kind of inflammation anywhere in the body, of course, is a huge problem. I mean, I thought I was going to die for the last year, and it turns out that I mostly probably was just suffering from chronic inflammation. So it is a huge, huge thing to cut your sugar down. And before we go further in talking about ayahuasca and these other compounds, because it doesn't just apply to ayahuasca, it's really important your diet. Everyone knows this, but I think that even those of us that are aware probably still uh, undervalue exactly what we need to do. And I have actually seen processed food stop people from having a psychedelic experience. I'm convinced that that's what it was. And the way that I figured this out, and again, this isn't like clinical research, obviously, it's just my observation. But this couple came to me for ayahuasca, and I gave them a lot of ayahuasca because nothing was happening, nothing was happening, nothing was happening. And so I was really just baffled, because generally after a certain point, it's going to start to work, right? So I had a bunch of mushroom honey with me, and I gave them several big spoonfuls. It was made from Pinnalis cyanescin, very, very strong. The mushrooms were still in the honey, so there's no chance that it didn't extract. Plus, I'd tried it. Still nothing happened. So eventually, I also had DMT with me. So I was like, okay, just smoke DMT until something happens. And eventually, of course, they did have an experience, and I was like, wow. It was their first psychedelic experience, and I thought, man, was that really just resistance, or, like, what is it that possibly could have stopped them? And then they asked me if I wanted a sandwich, and the sandwich they brought back was like aluminum silicate with, every bit of it, all of the stuff that they were eating was processed food with all sorts of additives. And my suspicion about this is that it's particularly aluminum that short circuits the ability of these compounds to do their job. I think it probably sits in the receptors and jams up so that the neurotransmitter, like mimicking compounds like LSD and psilocybin and whatever, they can't dock because of all the aluminum in your system. Again, this isn't science. This is just, I'm you know, based on my observation, it seems to be the case. Uh, so let's see. All right, so that's probably enough about psilocybin mushrooms. Oh, well, no. Let's talk a little bit about brain activity aside from rebuilding the brain physically, right? So we have the neurogenesis, we have the neuroplasticity, and in case you're not familiar with those terms, neurogenesis refers to actually generating new neural pathways, new neurons, rejuvenating dead brain cells somehow, in the case of psilocybin. And neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reconfigure itself. So researchers at Princeton looking at psilocybin and LSD said that a 55-year-old brain can be restored to the neuroplasticity of a 5-year-old with a few LSD sessions or psilocybin sessions over the course of a few weeks. So your ability to retain information can be restored to that of basically a toddler. So, I think this is earlier when I was saying that some of it is so over the top that it's hard to accept that we have actually demonized and prohibited the use of these compounds. I mean, there are 20-year-old kids that have been sitting in prison for 20 years, right, for these totally innocuous substances. So it's just mind blowing, and I think it was that same researcher that was asked to summarize his findings by Scientific American or someone, and he said, "I think that psychedelics are the most important discovery in the history of humanity." And so, once again, we're hearing these kind of Timothy Leary-esque, really over the top responses from Ivy League researchers. History's just repeating itself. And as I said before, in the 60s, Humphrey Osmond said that this stuff can fix every known neurological aberration. And now we have the John Hopkins guy saying it's unprecedented in the history of psychiatry that, medicine can be efficacious for such a wide spectrum of applications and oftentimes in a single dose. And this is why, as I was saying earlier, that big pharma, that the government actually made them illegal, is because they represented a threat to the dependency of people upon the government and big pharma, and also a huge threat to the profit margin of big pharma. Because if you can treat something with a single dose and a few hours of therapy, then why are you going, you know what I mean? You want to be able to prescribe treatments for symptoms, not cures. And that's what they do. I had lunch with a guy last year that used to be a big pharma executive, and that's exactly what he said. He said it got to his conscience eventually too much when he realized that they were in the business of symptom mitigation and not health at all, and that they were actually intentionally engineering medicines that kept people locked into a cycle of having to spend money on them. And so the difference in brain activity for a person that is actually under the influence of psilocybin, LSD is very, very similar and actually better in a lot of ways, at least, from a neurophysiological point of view. Both compounds cause an explosion of activity in the brain, and LSD in particular actually causes electrical activity in parts of the brain that are never active otherwise. We have no idea what that means. I think I do. I think those are the parts of the brain that deal with capacities of consciousness that we're still on the fence about, like telepathy and precognition, all things that I've experienced to a degree that I'm absolutely, totally, I know that telepathy, especially, is real. Precognition is a little bit more difficult because coincidence, when you have the problem with synchronicity, right, is that when you have this much information, the chances that a lot of it is going to correlate in meaningful ways, even extremely improbabilistic ways, is still pretty good, right? So it's more difficult to, be sure about precognition. But the point is that, this brain activity, this electrical activity in parts of the brain that are never used otherwise, is a remarkable and tremendous thing. And to go back to psilocybin, which is actually what we're focusing on at the moment, the inter-region communication. So the default mode network of the brain is communicating with the other part of the brain. I can't recall the name at the moment, but so you have this inter-region communication happening in the brain that doesn't normally happen. And there are also parts of the brain that are sort of quieted. And so this is what leads to the introspection, and they think maybe the spiritual insights and things of that nature. And so another way to think about this is that a bridge between the conscious and subconscious mind is created. And if you consider that, at 80%, some estimates are even higher, of our behavior is subconscious, to have a tool that can actually allow us to create a dialogue between normally non-communicative regions of the brain is a tremendous benefit for a whole host of reasons, right? And this is also one of the reasons why being able to address traumas is so powerful with these compounds. It's assisted so powerfully, right? Is that we have this doorway that's open, and then we also have a brain that is making new neurons 100 times, 100 to 1,000 times as quickly as normal, and it's also uh, way exponentially more neuroplastic. So while we have the door open, we're able to repattern and address these traumas and addictions and whatever it is. So we have access to more of the brain, we have greater communication happening, and whatever we figure out, we're able to imprint into the brain in a much more permanent fashion. And one of the misconceptions that people make about these compounds, they say, oh yeah, well, you have these revelations and you forget about them when you go back to your normal life. That's not actually true with a little bit of effort, and in fact, that's been studied as well. And our ability to retain information is greatly enhanced, but you have to maintain some focus on it. It's basically like if you heat up. Um, I don't know what's a good example of something that gets mushy when it's heated, and then it cools again and it's hard. That's the analogy I need. Do me a favor too, you guys. We have been demonetized, so we get no money. There's no super chat for you guys to support. I know it's an extra step, but we really do appreciate your support. Making these videos and live streams takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And if you don't support me, I get nothing for it. So there are options from cryptocurrency to PayPal and Zelle and Cash App in the chat and in the description. Um, so remarkable tools for healing, absolutely remarkable in so many ways. It's so multifaceted what happens when people consume these compounds under the right circumstances and for the right reasons. And in addition to all of that, one of the other researchers, maybe the same guy at Princeton. I should have organized this all better, but honestly, it's been a few years since I've looked at these studies. It's not like I go and review them all the time. But he said that uh, I can't remember the number of sessions. It wasn't very many though. It was like a few psilocybin sessions over a few weeks. A person that has consumed, 3 doses of psilocybin in the course of 6 weeks, their memory and emotional state is improved, and the improvements are still in effect 5 years later. They did follow-ups, right? 5 years later. So it appears that these changes are actually permanent in the brain. But once again, it's really important that you do these things correctly and that you learn techniques as well to guide and to navigate these spaces. So, if you don't have a lot of experience, it helps to consult with someone that's experienced. Um, Yeah, Kana actually grows here everywhere, and I wasn't aware that that's what it was until recently. So maybe I will give it a shot. I've never tried it before. How do you spell the mushroom that has MAOI in it? That is psilocybe mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, and probably panalis. I'm never sure how to say that. I would imagine does as well. I think it's like any of the psilocybin mushrooms. They're somewhere. Maybe I'll put a link in the description afterwards. There is actually a little bit of a chart with the different ratios that have been found of the harmalas in different mushrooms. So. Let's see, which compound should we move on to next? We've talked a little bit about LSD. We've talked about psilocybin. So let's talk about mescaline and San Pedro. And these are actually very different animals. Pure mescaline is very, very different from taking these various cactuses um, for a number of reasons, but most importantly because there are a dozen or more active alkaloids in San Pedro, and then there are different strains of San Pedro, different species, Peruvian torch and the Bergese that he mentioned, and a multitude of, well, not a multitude, but there's a handful of them. And then there's the PC Pacanoia, which, by the way, if you guys are in the United States, you see a San Pedro cactus, pulling over and grabbing a chunk of it is probably not going to do you any good because they're very, very low or completely absent in psychoactive alkaloids. And 90% of the time, the cactuses that you're going to find in the United States have no alkaloids. But what I'm getting at here is that a lot of the claims that have been made by shaman, or some of them at least, about the healing capacity aside from the spiritual, emotional, this stuff that comes from the psychedelic experience with mescaline. There are also medical benefits, and one of them that I think deserves attention. Um, a friend of mine has asthma, and the shamans say asthma is something that can be treated with San Pedro. And I was aware of this already from research, but I had never met anyone, right? And so this guy has never done any research. He's not really that familiar with psychedelic plants at all. And so there's no way that he read this anywhere. I'm sure he did not have this information prior to this experience. And so there's a town called Montanita on the coast of Ecuador that's a party town. It's like the only place in Ecuador where the cops are basically like, okay, drugs are kind of legal here. They don't really mess with anything. So it's just crazy Wild West beach town. And so he was out there and he had no money. And he lost his inhaler, and he was having a severe, severe, severe attack, and he could not get an inhaler. And so someone, not trying to help him with his asthma attack, but just because they were trying to bring him with them, said, come to this San Pedro ceremony. We actually, the indigenous people that work with Wachuma generally are on the coast here. And so, there was some legit indigenous San Pedro shaman out there, probably Kofan or something. And he drank the first shot of the San Pedro, and his asthma attack stopped immediately. And he said he's never had another one ever again, and it's been 10 years. And so that's a pretty remarkable story, and it's, I think, an untested claim or hypothesis. I've never seen anything in the literature so far about any clinical research being done. And Big Pharma hates this. Remember that. The fact that these plants are capable of curing things in a single dose, it does not make Big Pharma happy. And this is why they were banned in the first place, make no mistake about it. Because, as I said before, the researchers were blown away, sent the government report saying this is amazing, we can fix everything. And now, if you think about the injustice, and I know I'm backtracking a little bit here, but if you think about the injustice of the government that's supposed to take care of its people, right? It's supposed to work on behalf of its citizens, not only to know that these substances were relatively harmless, right? But that they were actually could be used to cure addictions, so that there are way less fatal drunk driving crashes, right? They can cure PTSD. So these guys that come back from military operations and then shoot a bunch of people, that wouldn't happen, right? I mean, so much of the suffering and tragedies of the last 50 years were totally avoidable, and the United States government was told what these compounds can do, provably and demonstrably, in the 1960s. In fact, they were so aware of it, they were taking it to really, really huge extremes. MK Ultra is one of those things that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. It's Freedom of Information Act. You can go to the CIA website, read this all for yourself. It's totally public access stuff. And what they were doing is they were kidnapping U.S. citizens, and they would go to the doctor, and then they were just gone. And what they were doing is strapping them to a table and giving them the maximum LSD. One of the things that is so remarkable about it is that it has a ceiling. And so at a certain point, it's like all your neurotransmitters are full and the extra LSD just washes through your system. So, you hear a lot of people telling stories about, oh, I took a high dose and I was tripping for 3 days and all of this kind of stuff. And most of those people are either lying or they took some STP, which is sort of similar to LSD, but it lasts for 72 hours. And the reason we know this is because there are 10 people that have done 20,000 micrograms or more, which is, a solid dose is about 100 micrograms, 200 is strong, 20,000 is a lot of LSD. And I think actually in both situations, someone had crystal LSD and they poured it out thinking it was cocaine or ecstasy or something, and everyone did big lines of it. And they all went to the ER, and they were all fine within 8 to 12 hours, and they were all checked up on 5 years later. No one reported flashbacks. No one had any problems. They were all totally fine. And I actually saw a PBS special where the guy was actually lying about this story and said that they had like bloody, they were vomiting blood and all of this crazy stuff. And it's not true at all. All the people were totally fine. And the reason is that it's just washing right out of your system, right? So don't get me wrong, it's not safe to take a maximum dose of LSD even with supervision, probably for most people. I know people that have done it. It sounds really interesting. Maybe I would do it on my deathbed or something, but it's pretty risky just in terms of the possibility that you're going to black out and hurt yourself. But the point is that what they were doing to these people is giving them the ceiling dose of LSD plus electroshock therapy, and they had discovered the neuroplasticity of the enhanced neuroplasticity, and so they would wipe the entire personality of the person clean, all their memories gone, and then they would reprogram another personality into the person. And so this one woman snapped out of it after 20 years or something, walking around in the grocery store. She's like, my name isn't Mary Silvana, it's whatever her real name was. And she contacted a lawyer, and they actually managed to get in touch with, somehow they found the Freedom of Information Act, and they were able to uncover what had happened to her. And so, totally true story. But, it just goes to show that the government has well understood what these things can do and how they work since, the late 1950s at least. And so let's move on to mescaline, because I want to at least touch on everything, and man, it's already taking forever. I mean, this is a subject I could talk about forever because there's so much to it. So we started to talk about San Pedro and mescaline. And I think one of the reasons that mescaline has been sort of overlooked in terms of its therapeutic and medical applications is that it just lasts for so goddamn long. Also, it's far more toxic than LSD or psilocybin. It's 500 times as toxic as LSD, which is actually less toxic gram for gram than vitamin C. It's extremely safe substance. Oh, I did forget to mention that it is a very interesting characteristic of psilocybin and LSD that they also stop working almost right away. So it's like there are built-in mechanisms against overdose and against addiction. So anyways, mescaline, there's at least one person that has overdosed and died, but he took like 500 grams, just ate a bowl of pure mescaline. He got his Darwin Award. Um, I mean, why the hell would you do that, but it's not really dangerous. It lasts a really, really long time. I have found myself awake for days and days and days after taking a relatively strong dose of it. And, there's also very strong vomiting and purging. But experientially, it is markedly different from these other compounds. And again, the only insight I can really offer comes from personal experience, because there isn't a tremendous amount of research that's been done specifically on mescaline, and I think that that's mostly due to the duration of the experience. But the energy of it, the visuals, everything about it is micro, like very, very small. When you see the color patterns of LSD, they're kind of like macro. They have lines that look like they're separated by a decent distance, and Generally, mescaline hallucinations are just tiny, 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 intricate patterns. And it is like being bombarded with information, information, information. It's very cerebral. You're learning a tremendous amount very, very rapidly. You also can have a tendency to get stuck in loops. It is very important to drink a lot of water to push the mescaline through. This will also shorten the length of the experience a little bit. People report a lot of past life regression type experiences and, subjective experiences on psychedelics. Who knows? But it's something people say a lot. And mescaline is very loving. It is related to MDMA. It's in the same chemical class. So it's also very speedy. So generally, San Pedro ceremonies will start really early in the morning, and then they'll go on until after dark, and it's very taxing physically. You'll often find yourself very, very tired the next day because of the high toxicity of mescaline. But again, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of research, but I think generally it's good for all of the same things that psilocybin and LSD have shown promise in terms of treating. And my subjective opinion is that when you're looking to heal trauma related to the masculine, which isn't necessarily only abuse by men, I mean something much more broad than that. Um, Self-esteem issues, um, motivation, enhanced learning. Also, if you are stuck and you need to have a breakthrough in terms of either introspection or creatively or professionally, I think mescaline might be a good go-to. It's also, this is the most interesting aspect of it for sure. Um, and mescaline is something you have to learn to do with practice, but you can actually create a bunch of windows of, of perception, and you can focus on each one of those windows simultaneously as if the totality of your focus was on one thing. So it's like multitasking in God mode. And the way that I discovered this was that one time I went to perform and I drank some San Pedro before I went to play. And at one point, I realized that I could focus on my diaphragm, I could listen to my tone, I could check my tongue position, I could think about my improvisations with my fretting hand. And when you're playing guitar and singing, usually you just play repetitive patterns, and improvising happens between the singing because it's just too much. So I was able to really just improvise as if that was all I was doing. I could practice. I could focus totally on my rhythm and strumming, and I could also listen to each individual instrument as if they were playing separately. I mean, it was really a tremendous thing. It's as if my consciousness, my focus, had been refracted in a crystal, and it was just everywhere and everything all at once. Um, so tremendously useful for a musician. And the thing is that this stuff is retained when the brain returns to its more hardened state. Right, it recrystallizes almost. These new imprints are retained to an extent, and so my ability to you know, improvise while singing, for example, has remained improved. My voice, my singing technique has remained improved. In fact, I should do this a lot more. So, that for me was the most valuable. And I'll share one other story because I think this is the best way to understand the nature of mescaline. Well, the San Pedro cactus. And I don't know if I mentioned that different cactuses have different ratios of different compounds. So that's why it's a lot different to take pure mescaline than to take the cactus. And something tells me it's not the mescaline that treats the asthma, but one of the other compounds in the cactus. Okay, so this is an experience that almost everyone has if you take a really, really high dose. Basically, not a dangerously high dose if you have supervision, but I wouldn't recommend this high of a dose alone because Another thing that mescaline or San Pedro does a lot is called blackouts, which is a little bit less common with psilocybin and LSD, but it's very easy to black out if you take too much San Pedro. And so on this occasion, I had taken a blackout dose, and I didn't know it yet. And I walked down to this deserted house that was on the property, and I went inside. And for a while, I was totally convinced that I was in a prison forever. And I was like looking out the window, thinking that if I crawled out, that someone would get me. And then I started to realize that like this none of this makes sense. You're paranoid, and I kind of got a hold of myself. And as soon as I calmed, right, because this is really important that you don't have this interference pattern of fear if you want to be receptive to the signals that are coming in. I haven't mentioned that I think one of the things that all of these compounds have in common is that there's a reducing valve in our perceptual apparatus because there's so much coming in from the universe. We perceive less than 1% of the full spectrum of light, for example. So, it has to be filtered out so that we can function and do pragmatic things. So it's an evolutionary adaptation, adaptation that our consciousness is filtering, and that's actually the main function of it, right? So. So that's what I'm saying. That you want to be able to receive the information coming from what I think of as the universal mind. And so once I was able to calm myself, this voice that I just thought of as the cactus. Well, actually, first I suddenly was in a sea of photons, excuse me. So there were these tiny little objects for trillions of miles. It was like I could see forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and some more forever. And I recognized them as photons, but they were also tesseracts, which are four-dimensional shapes, five-dimensional shapes. The point is that one of the dimensions is time, so you can never see the whole shape. The whole thing is always there, but you can never perceive it all at once because it's moving in time, right? So wherever you are in the present is going to determine how much of the shape you can see. And so they were like that, and I could zoom them in and turn them just by thinking about it and examine them, and they were morphing and changing into these crazy, geometrical constructs. And so, I put the one back, and then the cactus said, and I understood intuitively. I didn't need the cactus to explain to me that I was one of those things, and that what it represented was the consciousness of individuals. Each one was like an individual person, but they also somehow represented all of the energy in the universe, and because I think ultimately there's no difference. And so the cactus then said, "I want to show you something," and it blinked one of them out of existence, and I was gone. It's not like I was in darkness. There was no black. There was no clear. I was just completely gone. And so it was truly a terrifying experience to just suddenly not exist anymore, right? And then I snapped back and I asked the cactus, so what do you mean that it's all random and the universe was just this like crazy improbable accident? It was like, no, I'm showing you how perfect the design and the symmetry inherent in creation is. And so that experience of becoming a photon in a sea of photons is extremely common. A guy took a blackout dose next door one time. I went over and found him, and he was sitting there raving the billions and trillions and trillions and trillions and billions and billions. And I knew exactly what he was looking at. And then there was a San Pedro shaman that happened to walk up, had nothing to do with the situation. And he's listening to this, and he looks at me and he says, well, it's the light, right? It's the light telling him what it is and what it does. So, it's apparently an extremely common experience to become these photons, and you know what it is. You know that you're a photon, and the other things are photons, and you learn stuff about them. And so, here I am standing with this group of three people that had never discussed this, and very obviously all three of us had experienced it on high doses of San Pedro. And so that's that. One more time, guys, please do hit the like button, share, subscribe, and support us. We're demonetized. There are methods that you can choose to support in the chat and in the description. You can send crypto, BNB is great, and also Zelle, PayPal, and Cash App. I have to say it a couple times in every live stream because otherwise we get nothing. And so moving right along, let's see, where are we? THC is a psychedelic, as a matter of fact, and there are other cannabinoids in the cannabis plant that actually reduce the that inhibit the psychedelic effect of cannabis. In fact, my favorite strain is called LSD. It's bred by Barney's Farm, and it's not lemon sour diesel. It's a different strain. It's a Mazar Sharif crossed with lemon skunk, I think. Yes, they are the key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe. They're the best key that we have. And when people say, shouldn't you be able to do this by yourself? I always think, shouldn't you be able to go to the moon without a space shuttle? Shouldn't you just walk across the United States? I mean, and the thing is, like, you can think of it this way. If you are walking, you're safer. In a Lamborghini, though, you can get across the United States in like 10 hours. And if you crash your car at 220 miles per hour, you're much more likely to be injured. So, you know, you have to take things into consideration and be objective. But the reality is that these compounds are a fast track to higher consciousness and revelations and enlightenment. And I don't know that I'm talking about like the ultimate enlightenment, but definitely at least a kind of consciousness that is not available to the common man. I have never in my life met a person that really had the kind of consciousness that, you know, your average acid head on the corner in California and San Francisco has, that has not taken psychedelics. And I know whether someone has taken psychedelics usually by looking at them or definitely immediately upon interacting with them. It definitely transforms you, and I think of what it does basically inducing the gnosis and inducing gnosis reliably and consistently, whereas tools like meditation may or may not eventually yield some kind of illumination, or you know they will have some benefit, but I think that your best bet is to use these things in conjunction with each other. So you are accelerating your development and healing your traumas at an unprecedented rate. I mean, come on, if you just look at the statistical data and compare experiments with meditation and psychedelics, meditation doesn't come anywhere near, you know, it's like saying that your 1914 Ford Model T can outrun a Lamborghini Diablo. It's just evolution. It's a newer tool, and I feel that, you know, DMT, for example, has become so popular because if it wasn't available to us, since higher consciousness, gnosis, healing traumas, however you want to think about it, is essential to negating the advent of nuclear holocaust, you know, or the imminent destruction of mankind and our environment. We need a catalyst, and we don't have decades to sit around in a monastery meditating. That's just the reality of it. Okay, I'm not going to talk about THC though. Oh yeah, the LSD strain is just like LSD, low doses of LSD. Yeah, ketamine. Let's talk about ketamine. I have gotten in an awful lot of trouble with some people because they believe that ketamine is like psychedelic heroin, and I've heard it referred to as such. I have known ketamine addicts, so I think of all of the compounds that we're going to discuss, it is true and it is fair to say that ketamine is the most dangerous. Not, I don't know that it's even possible to overdose. I mean, maybe. I don't quote me. I have not looked at that. People have told me that you can't. I don't know if I believe them though, and I've never checked, so I don't know. But I know that very, very, very high doses are safe. Um, so ketamine has to be used with caution. And the only reason I would advocate for the use of ketamine at all is that it seems to do things that some of these other compounds are not capable of doing. And it is interesting that it has some of the same type of effects. You might see the same type of like energy grids, I think of them as, like the light ribbons that are floating in the air that you would see with LSD or psilocybin. But I think that's because those things are actually there, and that there are different ways to turn down the reducing valve in our consciousness temporarily. And so what you're perceiving is actually there. It's not a hallucination. And ketamine is a dissociative. It's been used in surgeries. It was originally like a tranquilizer for cats or something, and um, it also has that neuroplasticity enhancing effect that all of these other compounds do. So another just my intuition is that what this is actually coming from, we think of it as a chemical reaction, and on some level I'm sure that's true. But I think what's actually happening is that when we bring those filters down, it is contact with the universal mind that restores the neuroplasticity to our brains and is responsible for a lot of these other effects. It's not something that can really just be explained in terms of like chemical reactions and neurophysiology and neurochemistry. Um, Ketamine is extraordinarily good for ADHD, PTSD, and sometimes pain, certain types of pain, can be deactivated for long periods of time, and no one understands this. But in California, you can go and have a ketamine coma, it's called, where they put you under with a massive dose of ketamine for quite a while, I think 24 hours or something. And then when they resuscitate you, people with Lyme's disease and chronic pain type conditions will have no pain for like 6 months. And no one knows what the hell's going on there. Although I have some ideas about this. I think it works on pain in much the same way that it works on PTSD and depression, but particularly PTSD. So let me share an example of one story from one person that I think is kind of indicative of maybe this is on this whole time after all. I'm not really sure. Anyways, it's weird. It's like blinking. Um, this girl had severe PTSD, and so she injected intramuscular IM, which is a common way to use ketamine, not to inject in your vein, but you just stick the needle in your leg and inject it. I've never really noticed much of a difference. I've tried it both intranasally, or what is the word for that? Insufflating, and also intramuscular. I didn't really notice a big difference. But the dissociative, so it is my opinion and the opinion of a lot of other people that consciousness does not actually originate in the brain. It is generated by the three fields of physics interacting, electromagnetism and electricity, and I don't know if gravity has anything to do with it, but those three fields, right, interacting. And it is a fourth field, maybe a fifth field, the fifth element, the quintessence. Um, and so as proof of this, I would offer that there's a condition where people are born with no brain at all, none whatsoever, and usually they are very, very, very mentally disabled. But on occasion, they have been discovered to be fully functional people. And the most extreme case, a guy went to get a doctor. He's a doctor, went to get a brain scan for headaches, and he had no brain at all, just a little sac at the end of his spine. To me, that's it. Consciousness doesn't originate in the brain. Also, mycelium is conscious. Paul Stamets recently did experiments that proved that, and so mycelium doesn't have a brain either, right? So I think that consciousness is a unified field, and one of the things that ketamine can do is completely disassociate your consciousness from your body. People report 360-degree vision, so you can see in every direction all at once, being able to float around. I have witnessed, just like near-death experiences, people that could not possibly have been present for a conversation, like way out in the woods in the backyard at a party, right? They're passed out in a K-hole in the bedroom, and then they're like, hey, man, that was a really crazy pipe you guys were smoking with out there, or they're aware of a conversation, And there's just no fucking way that they were, eavesdropping over all the loud music. And I know they were in a K-hole. You know what I mean? And this, that's back in my 20s, but this is a really commonly reported experience. But aside from all of this crazy consciousness stuff, in terms of clinical uh, use, this girl took the high dose of, that I know, took a high dose of ketamine, and she said she found herself in this like pure white light, but there was sort of a floor, and there were puzzle pieces or these blocks that fit together in a certain way. And she understood that if she could put the puzzle pieces back together uh, correctly, that her PTSD would be gone. And her PTSD was totally debilitating, like losing her mind several times a day, unable to hold a job, no relationship, like totally just in a bad place, right? And stuck there for life. Been a long time, 10 years, I think. And so she did this. She organized these blocks and put them together. Never had another episode of PTSD ever again in her life. And this same exact experience of putting these blocks together, and then when the blocks are reassembled, the person no longer has PTSD, or they're no longer depressed, or whatever the case may be. And so for PTSD, and certain types of pain management. And you guys have to understand that if you have chronic Lyme disease, you have no choice but to take opioid painkillers. So the fact that you can be injected once with ketamine, and then not have pain for 6 months means you don't have to be addicted to pharmaceutical painkillers, and you don't have to continue to use ketamine either. Okay, so this is, yes, please do smash the like button. I just plugged everything a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to do it to you again. Thank you, Flezik. And support us too. In the chat and in the description, there are options, and we get nothing from YouTube, and there's no chat, super chat. You guys used to always, people would just click it because it's right there, and you can impulse do it. And it's crazy how different it is when people have to go through an extra step. Anyways, so that's about enough about ketamine. It is the most predisposed to abuse of all of these compounds, but it also can do things that none of the rest of these compounds can do, at least not as well. And so moving right along to, somebody asked about kratom. Speaking of addiction and pain, kratom is a tree from Southeast Asia. They occur in Bali and Thailand, and I think there's a Hawaiian strain. There's a whole bunch of different ones. The white, red, and green are not different types. They are different stages in the plant's growth, different ages, right? So the white one is more for energy. It's more energizing, just like a young person. The green ones are euphoric and somewhere between the red and the white, right? And then the red is for pain mitigation. So the problem is that it is physically addictive. It is not an opiate, but it's an opioid, or it's an opioid antagonist. So it works on, it's not an opioid, but it works on the same receptors, and so there is withdrawal, but for most people, it's not nearly as bad as withdrawal from Oxycontin or Suboxone, or, I mean, even heroin compared to some of the things that they agonist, right? Excuse me. I guess Suboxone is an antagonist. So for most people, it's not as bad. And honestly, for me as a person with chronic health problems, it really did give me my functionality back to a degree that I really miss because I don't have access to it here. But it is very bad for your liver. It does a lot of liver damage, and it's physically addictive, and it's not really a fun withdrawal. Like you'll kick like with opiates, and you can't really sleep. But it's nowhere near as severe for most people. Charles said that he had an ex-girlfriend that had a harder time with it. But the other advantage of it is that you can often walk right out of an opiate addiction with it. because you can just taper down. It's much easier to taper down with kratom because you can just weigh powder on a scale, and oh, maybe the mic just wasn't connected. That's a damn shame. Let me see here. Okay, so well, right, but they're referred to as like opioid antagonists for because partial agonist. Yeah, there you go, partial agonist. That's the word. Um, Definitely know more about psychedelics than I do about. Yeah, I'll talk about ayahuasca admixture plants. Uh, that might be an entire video, entire video. But we should talk about ayahuasca and DMT because I haven't gotten to those. But while we're on the subject of synthetics, we should talk about MDMA because MDMA also has applications that these other compounds are not as good at, and you know, it's. Did I turn the mic back on? Or maybe I turned it off. Maybe it was on the whole time. Here, let me try. Sorry, all this stuff is new and you guys. Hello? Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Hello everyone. Gotcha. Okay. Okay, now that we've lost everyone, um, now that we have lost everyone, let's try to keep going. I just realized that I never turned my light on either. Um, well, that's too bad. We had a good audience. I mean, you guys are a good audience, but it's probably just the hardcore ones now. Um, okay, so let's give it a second and see. I thought maybe starting over would have been better because then we would get the people back. Um, but whatever. This way, people can watch it, I guess, in full if they want to later, and it'll all be there. So MDMA. Probably the best thing about MDMA is that it's really great for healing relationships. Of course, it is more prone to abuse. It's a widely used party drug, and for good reason. It's awesome, um, but from a medical point of view, from a clinical point of view, in the 1980s, before it was made illegal, um, where can people find medicines like ketamine? Well, you can have ketamine therapy in some states, like California, and places like Ecuador and Peru. You can just go to the veterinarian and tell them that your cow is hurt, and they'll just sell it to you. Um, so, uh, but MDMA, it people in the 80s, what is going on with this now? Okay, there we go. People in the 80s were that were having marriage problems, were given it in marriage counseling, and the rate of, I don't know what it's called when people stay together, right? They didn't divorce. So the success rate was 85% higher. That number comes up a lot in psychedelic therapy for some reason. Man, I'm not. There we go. Okay. Uh, 5 years later, they were still together. And the normal rate was like 11%. So, of all of the things that MDMA is good for, that's probably it. And also, self love. You can really forgive a lot and sort of um, come to terms with yourself and understand yourself. It's a hell of a tool for introspection. And it can also be used in combination with psilocybin and LSD with remarkable uh, uh, results. But mostly for me, I think the ability to heal relationships that are terminally wounded is the thing that MDMA can do that the rest of these compounds aren't quite as good at. Um, it also is being used with great success for military people with PTSD. And one of the advantages of both ketamine therapy, but particularly MDMA, is that a lot of people that have psychological conditions uh, may have a psychotic episode triggered, or it can be too much anxiety for someone that has really bad PTSD. But with MDMA, you can take it without the same risk of triggering bad psychological reactions. So that's those are really the two major advantages, that you can heal terminally wounded relationships, and the fixes last, right? And also, you can use MDMA for just about everything you can use the other compounds for, but without risk of triggering like really bad anxiety or psychological problems like schizophrenia. By the way, the reputation that psychedelics have for making people insane is mostly um, nonsense. Oh, I used to live in DC. I don't live in DC anymore. I live in Ecuador. Oh, you're saying decriminalize all natural psychedelics. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense because it's federal property. And so if the feds, that's a strange thing. You would think they would have to do it federally. Um, but I mean, I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so what were we talking about? MDMA and its applications. I think we got through that, right? I mean, it's just, psychosis. That's right. Okay, so psychedelics will not cause people that are not predisposed to mental illness any kind of psychotic reaction. You will not go crazy. You can take as much as you want, pretty much for as long as you want. I wouldn't push that too far, but I used to eat LSD as if it was a vitamin. In fact, in California, it's considered like food. Um, Lighter monkey? Are you talking about lighter monkey? Uh, and so, as long as you are not predisposed to mental illness, psychedelics do not represent a threat to your sanity. They just don't. And flashbacks have been debunked as rumor. And I personally don't believe in persistent perceptual disorder. I think that people change their consciousness, and the parameters of what's available to them to experience actually change. And you're not expecting that. So they think they're stuck high, when in reality, what's happening is that they have expanded their consciousness, and now they're living in a basically with a new dimension of reality. It's kind of subtle, but it's definitely a little bit more magical. And I think it's unfortunate that people go to doctors and the doctors say, "Oh, yeah, well, you have a disorder now. You shouldn't have taken psychedelics." We really have a long way to go in terms of reform. So I'm almost tempted to do this in a separate episode because I'm obviously wearing down a little bit. But let's talk about N-dimethyltryptamine because I have enough battery life left, and ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, I think, is probably the most remarkable thing on earth. It is one of the weirdest possible experiences. It's so strange and just it's like something that shouldn't be able to happen, and yet it does anyways. It the compounds were referred to as telepamine and telepathine uh, uh, for until the researchers felt like it was too flaky or something. I don't know exactly what happened there, but the Harmala alkaloids originally were telepamine and telepathine, and the reports of telepathy with ayahuasca go all the way back to Sir Walter Raleigh. You asked about ayahuasca admixture plants. I'm drinking them. Guayusa and Uñedegato are both in this tea. And so, where are we at? Okay, so these experiences of telepathy are very, very common. If you hang around people that drink ayahuasca, you eventually will start taking it for granted. It's not difficult even. It becomes not it becomes it is bitter. It becomes the rule rather than the exception. And also a very common experience with ayahuasca is that you can see through the pineal gland, which has rods and cones, and it's connected to the neovisual cortex. It is an eye, and it's associated, I think, quite correctly with sixth sense, right? Capacities of consciousness that we're still in kind of denial about. And so I discovered this one night laying out on a deck in the jungle. I realized I could see through my forehead. It was kind of orange, I think, because I was looking through bone and blood. So I waved my hand around in front of my face to see if I could see it. And man, why is it so hard to keep this centered? And well, actually, what precipitated it all is that a bug landed on my forehead, a mosquito, and I heard it, and then it bit me, and I realized it was real. I was watching it land. And so I started waving my hands around to see if I could see them for sure. And then I was looking up and down the railing, and I thought, well, my mind could configure all of this probably. So I wasn't convinced yet. But then the next day, when I went downstairs to see the shaman in the morning, he said, "Not good morning. How are you doing? How was last night's experience for you?" Which is the normal shit he would say in the morning. He said, "Sometimes you can see through your forehead when you drink the medicine." And so for him to just randomly say that to me first thing in the morning, I felt like verified two things: the telepathy that ayahuasca induces, and also the fact that you can see through your pineal gland, which I had never heard before. And then when I got home, I did some research and discovered that it has rods and cones and that it's attached to the visual processing unit in the brain. And so all sorts of crazy experiences like that occur with ayahuasca. And I think the real well, there's a number of pretty heavy duty. Ayahuasca is like pushing a button in an elevator and you go somewhere else. Like I don't feel altered when I drink ayahuasca. I'm just as clear as I would be at any other time. I may have moments where the visions are so strong that I couldn't really do stuff, but your state of mind doesn't really change too much. You're just as clear as you normally are. Some people don't experience that, but that's how it is for me. And so I compare it to pushing a button on an elevator and just going to a different dimension. And in this dimension, there is a woman, usually, although this is one of the misconceptions of ayahuasca. Not everyone reports that Pachamama is female. A lot of people say that it's male or neither. So there is no consistent consensus on the sex of Pachamama, which a lot of people have trouble accepting. It's called anchoring bias. Whatever you're told first, you tend to believe, right? So people have this anchoring bias that they believe that Pachamama is a female, but there are definitely tribes that don't. believe it has a sex. But in my experience, it's been a female narrator, although that could be because I was expecting a female narrator. But people that were polled that didn't have any expectations did not experience it as female. It was 51% female and 49% male. So if people don't have expectations, they actually do not experience ayahuasca as a female spirit. What's interesting though is that most of them do experience an intelligence, and it is very, very difficult to believe that it is not a non-human intelligence. When ayahuasca begins, you generally feel like there's some powerful ancient presence somehow is just there, and that's the first indication that's starting to work. Except it'll feel like there's a serpent kind of squirming around in your stomach a lot of times, like literally a serpent. Like you can feel the whole thing twisting around. And then also vasoconstriction can scare the hell out of you. If you go to drink ayahuasca and you get freezing cold, don't worry, you're not about to die. It used to scare the shit out of me because I thought maybe I was going to be one of those people that just drop dead for no reason. But what it is just vasoconstriction, and it's not threatening. So, if you get really cold, just relax. And I'm sure you guys all know that ayahuasca causes profound visions, and they're coming from the DMT aesthetic because that's what produces the visions. And so mostly we have tetrahydroharmine, Harmala, and yeah, those two. And it's a really interesting pharmacological mystery because it's not that there are only two plants. There are lots of plants that contain DMT in the jungle, and then there's only ayahuasca, the vine, that could be used as the MAOI. Um, yeah, sometimes I hear the DMT sound, sort of, but it's more of a feeling than a sound. But the really interesting thing about ayahuasca that may actually be explained by the phenomena of biophotons, which we'll get to in a second. Um, if you've ever been to the Amazon rainforest, there's more biodiversity in a half acre than there is in the entire state of Oklahoma, right? Like, and it's mostly plants. So there's just so many species of plants. And so here in Ecuador, we have Chaliponga, which is Diplopterus cabrerana, which is the DMT plant. And interestingly, it has both 5-MeO DMT, which is the compound that's associated with the toad, and then it has N-dimethyltryptamine, which is the one that we generally smoke, and the one that's found in Psychotria viridis, the chacruna, that's used in Brazil and Peru and maybe Colombia. I don't know which one they use in Colombia. I think it's the chacruna. Um, and so you have to combine it in a certain ratio with the Banisteriopsis caapi vine, or the leaves. And so the idea that they would stumble upon combining exactly these two plants in exactly a certain way of all the plants in the rainforest and create this concoction seems, and especially 72 different tribes throughout the Amazon basin. And people used to say that they just taught each other, but if the Warani saw another tribe, they would just spear them. The Shuar too. The Shuar were extremely fierce. So it's kind of a mystery that it ever came into existence. And one of the theories is that biophotons, which sound like a new age woo kind of thing, but they have actually been studied. You can look it up, Google it. Every centimeter of tissue that contains DNA, so whether it's plant or animal, as long as it has DNA, it's emitting packets of light, photons, at the rate of 100 per square centimeter per second. And so these packets of light contain information. And so all of the plants and all of the animals are showering each other with this light that actually contains information. And cells have been proven to be able to receive that information and interpret it. So one of the theories is that indigenous people have the capacity to receive this information consciously, and that's when they say that they're listening to the forest. What it actually means is that they have not, their evolutionary process has not de-emphasized and devolved the ability to receive this information from DNA consciously. And so once again, we're kind of taking the woo out of mysticism, because everything that happens on this plane has a mechanistic basis. There's some mechanism that facilitates that action. Um, So, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's no way, because one of the things that they do to make their medicines in the jungle is they combine plants. Like there's you can always buy, like at Quechua markets, these bottles of plantas medicinas that have been extracted now in alcohol, but of course that's not traditional. And they often have like 28 plants mixed together, and it'll be like cascarilla, which apparently cures COVID, and chuchuasi, and uña de gato, and guayusa, and all of these different plants all together. So, anyways, ayahuasca, and so the really crazy part about it is that Harmala alkaloids are psychoactive, but not very psychoactive if they're taken alone. But if they're taken with DMT, they're catalyzed, they're potentiated themselves, and then on top of that, the DMT is usually rendered inactive by a metabolic salt in the stomach. And so, man, my leg broke on my stand for the camera. That's why it's so wobbly. I have to hold it. Um, I was doing better when I was just holding it in my hand. Maybe I'll get used to this. So there's a metabolic salt in your stomach that renders the DMT inactive, right? So if you take an MAO inhibitor, it actually destroys that salt, so the DMT becomes orally active. So it's really a tremendous thing that they figured out to combine these two plants in order to create this super psychedelic that makes LSD look like aspirin. And the main point of ayahuasca is healing emotional trauma. It definitely, whether it's a female spirit or not, it has very feminine emotional qualities. It's very mysterious. It's kind of dark, and the purging, the physicality of it, right? The body, all of these things that we associate with femininity. Ayahuasca definitely has a relationship with them all. And most indigenous people, and just people like myself that have experience with plant medicines, associate the San Pedro with masculine and cerebral and all of that sort of energy, and phallic and solar and light and all this stuff, right? And ayahuasca is taken at night, and it's emotions and water and the body, and all of this kind of stuff. And so one of the main characteristics of ayahuasca that is so baffling to Western minds is that it cleanses your emotional body by causing you to vomit. And it sounds ridiculous to the rationalist Western mind, but the reality is that once you experience it, it's kind of hard to deny. I have experienced vomiting, these black tendrils of energy that when they come out, the memory that created the trauma is like passing very rapidly through the mind, and then it exits the body through the mouth in the form of like ectoplasm, I guess. And you vomit out the trauma, and you walk away, and it's gone. It's like you've actually left it in the lawn or in the jungle or wherever you are, and it never can bother you ever again. And so, ayahuasca, of all of these compounds, is definitely the most powerful healer in the emotional department. Well, it's not that you would not experience enough from tea. It's not necessarily that you would need to make a paste. What you would need to do, I think, is increase the ratio of the DMT containing plant. I usually use about 100 grams of bark or vine to um, 12 grams of chaliponga, which is an awful lot, or 50 grams of chacruna, and that'll do the trick. So, ayahuasca, one of the other aspects of, I'm just going to take this off this light. One of the other aspects of, there we go, of ayahuasca that makes it so useful as a healing tool is the admixture plants, which someone asked about. So you have bobinsana, you have uña de gato, guayusa, chaliponga, chacruna, but those aren't really admixture plants. The DMT containing plants are more like part of the recipe, right? So bobinsana, uña de gato, guayusa, um, chuchuasi probably, and even mapacho tobacco. And tobacco is actually taken, drank as a medicine. I've done this, and it healed my anger problem. And a lot of people are really put off by the idea of drinking tobacco because we think of it as poison. But a small amount of poison is medicine, and I've experienced tremendous healing from tobacco. It's not something to be taken lightly, but a lot of people will add just a small amount of Mapacho tobacco to the brew because it focuses the mind, it kills parasites, and it's just, and it also is, thought by the indigenous to put us in touch with the grandfather spirit, the masculine aspect of the guiding process. It's also taken as a liquid tea through the nose quite commonly, particularly by the Shuar. And it's an interesting practice because that allows the medicine to enter the bloodstream without being altered by the metabolic salts and whatnot in the stomach. Um, yeah, and people use Toei, which is extremely dangerous. Definitely don't want to do that if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, you don't want to do any of this if you don't know what you're doing, but particularly Toei, the Brumansia, the Devil's Trumpet. But I, and also from a Schwar point of view, which is how I was taught, suppressing the vomiting is defeating the purpose. Like to the Schwar, the vomiting is more important than the visions. The main thing is the vomiting, and so to suppress the purge is just kind of ridiculous. Like that, I don't want to put down anyone's tradition by calling it ridiculous, but you know what I mean. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why anyone do that, and it is dangerous. Most of the deaths that occur in conjunction with ayahuasca are from Toei admixture. Bobinsana is miraculous at opening the heart. It also contains Harmala alkaloids. It is in the mimosa family. It has those pink, white fir flowers, the little starburst dealies, and it actually works. I had never felt love in my entire life. I realized once I did feel it, until I had consumed ayahuasca with Bobinsana. And so its ability to open the heart is incredible. And it's also said that, the reason to add these admixture plants is that the ayahuasca opens us up to being more receptive to whatever it is that these plants do. So they're made more efficacious by consuming them while uh, while we have ayahuasca in our system. And there's different ways of thinking about it. Is your energetic grid is open, and so you're receptive to the teachings and to the healing of these plants that are infiltrating your aura, or however, whatever new agey way you want to put it. But seriously, guayusa also has a tremendous wide range of benefits in terms of antioxidants, and it has some caffeine, which could serve the purpose of kind of keeping you energized during ceremony. Cherokee Sanonga is also added to ayahuasca. I forgot to mention that. Um, Uña de Gato as well has a huge list of clinically tested medical applications. It is tumor shrinking. It is anti-cancer in the first place, immune system boosting. I mean, the list was actually shocking. How many proven treatment applications there are for uña de gato, which is also called cat's claw, because it looks like it has a claw, and the vine attaches itself to the trees and to the canopy with these claws, and so it is like peeled apart and smashed up and put into the brew, or you can just drink it. I would recommend to anyone that you take uña de gato, but you have to be aware that taking it for prolonged periods of more than like 6 weeks could be dangerous. I'm not sure exactly why, but I've read that in a number of places that you shouldn't. Yeah, the Sanonga. But when I said Cherokee Sanonga, I'm actually not talking about um, the same thing. Cherokee Sanonga is a poisonous plant. It's a white and purple flower. Well, it has white and purple flowers. They're separate. But Cherokee Sanonga, it causes heat flushes when you put it in ayahuasca. And if you don't know what you're doing, again, you should not just throw a handful of Cherokee into your ayahuasca because it will cause you problems. But it has a whole host of attributed health benefits. Uña de gato, a tremendous one. Um, what is dragon's blood? Sangre de drago is also used, and sangre de drago has been studied, and it causes the body to heal wounds and repair cells at an extremely accelerated rate. So, most of these indigenous applications for all of these plants have been confirmed in clinical studies. And generally, what they say is, something to the effect that um, all folk remedies confirmed, or something to that extent or effect. Um, Cacao is another one that, although not really necessarily taken during ayahuasca ceremonies, it is. Why does it look like my finger is in the? My thumb is somehow. Oh, I see. It's this part of my hand. Um, okay. Uh, it's where chocolate comes from, and it causes increased serotonin production, and it is full of antioxidants. The blue green algae alkaloid that only blue green algae has it also exists in cacao pods. It's actually like a tropical fruit. It kind of tastes like a mixture of pineapple and coconut or something. And I don't dry it or anything. I just eat the fresh pod, crack it open, and eat all the beans inside. It has like a white pith on it. It's extremely nutritious, and it increases serotonin, so it can help you with depression. And people use it in a ceremony to bond, to increase like loving feelings, which of course we already associate with chocolate. So um, let's see, have I missed any other questions? So yeah, ayahuasca mostly for healing trauma. But here's an interesting thing about the ayahuasca industry. Ayahuasca was not used to cure anything prior to 1993. That's not what it was for. It was for divining, it was for getting information, and it was for allowing the shaman to figure out how to heal you. But none of these ayahuasca ceremonies are really traditional. They were all created in order to create industry. And I'm not trying to put down the practice of people commercially drinking ayahuasca, um, but I am kind of. I think it's better that people do it than not. But what irks me about it is that people have basically come to believe a lot of things that were just created in the last couple of decades at the most. And if you don't adhere to them, as I don't, they think that you're fake or that you don't know what you're doing. And the reality is that you're just not conforming to the expectations that tourists have when they're drinking, uh, you know, tourist medicine, basically. For example, I've had people tell me that their maestra conformed to a strict diet of white rice and chicken that they have consumed before ayahuasca for 5,000 years on a continent where white rice and chicken were introduced 200 years ago. So there is an awful lot of just BS. And the dieta, and there, okay, so there's real dietas. The real dieta is if you are trying to heal something, or a shaman needs a certain type of insight, or whatever his purposes are, he will have a certain diet, and then he'll use certain plants for a certain period of time. And there's all these crazy protocols, complicated protocols that go along with it. But this thing of like only eating certain foods and all of this, after a ayahuasca ceremony, Shwar will eat a monkey. There are a lot of kind of ridiculous misconceptions. Also, I see a lot of people talking about how ayahuasca, if everyone just drank ayahuasca, there would never be a war. The ayahuasca drinking tribes in the deep jungle will still occasionally spear each other. and I mean each other in their tribe. They'll definitely spear other tribes. So there are a lot. I think it's really important to be realistic about what these plants do. And one of the things about psychedelics is they're to some extent, what they do has to do with what you expect them to do, right? So people think they're going to drink ayahuasca and they're going to become a peaceful vegan. It's very likely that that's what they'll experience. But if you look at it traditionally, it's not. It doesn't reduce violence amongst the indigenous people that discovered it. So I don't really see, that it's just automatically going to do that. Of course, because it enhances neuroplasticity and catalyzes neurogenesis, just like all the other psychedelics. Whatever it is, whatever change that you wish to affect in yourself, it's going to help facilitate that. And the way I explain this is that ayahuasca is positive. It is pro-life, but it's going to help you adapt to your environment, no matter what that means. So if it needs to make you a better warrior, it's going to make you a better warrior. If it's better for you to eat meat, it's going to want you to eat meat. Because I don't know that it's even really like a spirit. I think of it as a gateway to the universal mind, and also a way to access our own subconscious. And I have to admit that I do feel that there is some sort of predator human intelligence, but I've never been able to decide exactly what its nature is or what exactly it is. Um, Fasting for a week before ceremony, sure. I mean, one of the benefits of the dieta, even though it's not traditional, as a lot of people would have you believe, right? One of the benefits of it is that you have to commit to making changes. You are the most complete set of talents and virtues, totally useless in the absence of willpower and discipline, right? So having some kind of attitude of dedication to the preparation going into it is going to just sort of set a frame of mind that you mean what you're doing, and you're doing it for a reason. Um, so and also just kind of cleaning out the whole system. I mean, I don't know about fasting for a week, but we certainly would fast like one way that I've consumed ayahuasca in the Shuar way. They'll go and walk all day, and walking in the jungle, especially in this area, is not easy. It's mud. It rains all the time, right? So you're walking in a foot of mud. It's mountainous. It's not flat. So it's really rigorous. And if you haven't eaten for days and you're hiking around the jungle for 10 hours, and then you get back to the house and you drink ayahuasca, and you only have a little bit of water, and then you sleep for 4 hours and you drink ayahuasca again before you go hiking, only it's just a little bit, like a sip, and then you hike all day again and you come back completely exhausted, and they give you like 45 minutes to rest, and then you drink ayahuasca again. And if you were doing this as a tribal initiation, it actually goes on for 28 days, full moon cycle. Sorry, since my little leg broke on my stand, I'm having to hold the camera, and I've been holding it for 2 hours, 2.5 hours now. So my arm's getting a little tired. But we're almost through all these compounds, so I want to try to make it, I guess. Do me a favor too, hit the like button, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon, or if you want to make one-time contribution, you can. There are options, cryptocurrency and Zelle and PayPal in the chat and in the description for the video. We really do appreciate it because we have no super chat and we get no money otherwise. Obviously, I put a ton of time and energy into this stuff, so um, help me help you. Okay, so let's just talk about DMT. 5-MeO DMT and NN-DMT and 5-HO DMT are all different types of DMT that have different effects. I read somewhere that 5-MeO DMT, or 5-HO, excuse me, which is Biophotons, is actually converted into 5-MeO DMT when it's burned. So I'm not sure that that's actually accurate, but that's what I read. 5-HO DMT is the least psychoactive and the most physically difficult. It is present in very high concentrations in the Wilca seed, and I think in Yopo, although I think Yopo and Wilca are almost the same thing. One is Adenanthera calabrina, and the other one is a tree called Adenanthera um, peregrina. And So it's a little red flat seed. I actually have some. Let's see if I can grab it. Oh, I might have left it downstairs actually the other day. Yeah, I don't see it. Anyways, it's a little red flat seed that comes from this tree, and it has all sorts of stuff in it. Lots of different psychoactive compounds, and it's very, very physically difficult. It comes on with this feeling of tremendous pressure and like pulsing, really quickly moving orange and yellow lights. And it's a combination of all three different types of DMT. So there's NN-DMT, there is 5-MeO DMT and 5-HO DMT, and depending on whether it's the yopo tree or the woka tree, there are different concentrations. But then there's also a whole ton of medically active other types of compounds, and I mean like 40 of them. Lots and lots and lots, including harmalas, which are going to have some interaction with the DMT. And it's an incredible thing. I have experienced um, ancestor contact and stuff. I don't want to get too into that. If you're interested in Yopa Wilka, check out my experience videos. Um, and so let's talk a little bit about DMT. I think that's the last thing on our list. Uh, so 5-MeO DMT from the frog, unity consciousness. We're talking like nirvana, the absolute highest attainment, the highest realm possible to human experience. You're catapulted into that for maybe 5 minutes, but trust me, that 5 minutes might as well be a few hundred years. And what people generally report is it's actually not very hallucinogenic. It is just bright white light, or you become unconscious, which I think is unfortunate. It's good to develop your concentration if you're going to be using these psychedelics, to put some energy into it so that you can maintain your focus in these states if you're going to be taking high doses. Very important. And I'll actually offer you a meditation technique that you can use, because there are different types of meditation, right? There's pranayama, and then there's like focusing meditation, and then there's emptying the mind meditation, which is the most common, where you just focus on the breath, and it's passive, right? Focusing on the breath, trying to empty your thoughts, letting them pass without judgment and all that stuff. But then there's also like focused meditation, where, for example, you could use one of the tattvas. So you'll have like a blue square with a yellow circle around it, and you want to picture it, and then you want to hold it so that nothing changes at all. And every time something changes, you have to start over. And you'll be amazed at how ingenious and devilish the mind is at escaping control, right? It will escape your control every few seconds. And so this is a very good type of meditation. I think it's also a good meditation to do in the morning, because you're setting your intentions and your focus, and making your mind like a focused laser beam. And then before you go to sleep at night, doing the emptying passive style of meditation. And also, to use them before and after ceremony is very good. Speaking of it, though, I did forget to mention this when we were talking about LSD earlier. Pranayama, if you're trying to program, and this isn't specific to LSD, you can use this technique with ayahuasca, DMT, whatever it is that you're after, and you don't have to do the whole like, you're supposed to put your fingers on your nose and alternate nostrils. You can do that if you like, but I find it distracting. And I think the important part is that you're inundating the brain with oxygen, right? And then you're holding it in. Because in pranayama, you inhale for a measured count, hold for a measured count, exhale for a measured count, and keep it distended for a measured count. And so what this does is it inundates the brain with oxygen, which is the fuel it needs to build itself. And then when you exhale and you keep it distended, you're depriving the brain of oxygen. And as you build your ability to do this in longer and longer periods, what's happening is that you are accelerating your journey into higher states of consciousness. So samsara and satori, nirvana eventually, all of these things are going to happen very, very rapidly compared to other forms of meditation. And because of the retention of oxygen, when you have taken LSD or psilocybin, if you're trying to repattern, this is how I quit smoking. Um, and I'll still occasionally, have a cigarette if I chew coca or something, but I definitely don't smoke habitually. As the current juncture, I haven't smoked a cigarette in over a month, I think. And I was a chronic smoker, and it only took 2 hours to stop habitually smoking with 100 micrograms of LSD. And pranayama is how I did it. You just sit, and on your in breath, you're telling the brain what you're trying to pattern. So I don't want to smoke anymore. I don't want to smoke anymore. I don't want to smoke anymore. While you're holding the breath in, and while you're exhaling, you're letting go of that which does not serve you. And then when you have the breath fully distended, you have to make sure you get all of the oxygen out from the very bottom all the way down to the bottom of your diaphragm, and you hold it out, and you just have to have a rhythm. So in hermetic magic, for example, magicians will generally use the fourfold breath, which is just counts of four, and that's a really simple one. I was probably going more like six or thing to kind of push it a little bit. But this is the most powerful tool for repatterning. So if you're trying to fight an addiction and you want to use, moderate dose of psychedelics and a meditation technique, I would strongly advise you to get good at pranayama, because this is how you're going to repattern the brain and free yourself from these things. Melt the mind forged manacles. Um, okay, so DMT, 5-MeO DMT. We were talking about how the white light and the unity consciousness and this experience of being in this place where there's no time, there's no desire, there's just nothingness for all of eternity, and it's sort of like bliss, but it's also kind of like nothing, and it's a very powerful experience, and it's beyond, beyond language. So I'm not going to profane um, you know what I mean? Like, there's just really no point in trying to talk about it. But an in-depth dimethyltryptamine is something that we sort of can talk about. There are limits to our ability to describe this, because I think it's happening on the plane of like pure consciousness, where things are happening in maybe 22 dimensions. So we actually don't have language to describe a lot of the things that you can observe in the DMT state. Also, the entities that people encounter are very, very convincing, to the extent that Rick Strassman, who engineered the experiments that and oversaw the experiments that resulted in the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Um, the the people talking to entities actually freaked him out so badly that he shut down his own study, because he said it just challenged his worldview. His ontological investment was had just suddenly crashed. Man, I'm glad we're on our last compound, because my arms are getting really tired. So DMT is smoked or inhaled or taken with ayahuasca, and it is usually, if you're going to smoke crystals of it, it's extracted from a plant called Mimosa hostilis, and it is a plant that has purple bark and grows in Brazil and Colombia and other places. And the effects of DMT come on within like a few seconds, and it is extremely powerful. It's usually precipitated by this crazy ringing sound that you can also feel, that is like getting ripped out of this dimension. It kind of reminds me of like Velcro being peeled, crossed with nails being scraped on a chalkboard. Luckily, it only lasts for a few seconds, and then there's this very rapid sort of gyrating orange, always orange. Like everyone says it's orange, and we call it the waiting room, right? Red and orange, moving real fast, uh, weird geometrical stuff. And then if you get a strong enough dose, you can break through to the second level, which is where the jesters are. And the jesters are like these weird clowns that are always giving people the middle finger, or they're juggling something weird. And then beyond that, we're in the realm of total hyperspace. And this is where shit really gets like next level insane. The self-transforming machine elves are often encountered, and they have these Rubik's cubes that are made of colored light, and they'll be telling you that, come look, this is how we create dimensions. Or, as Terrence McKenna said, jumping in and out of your chest and telling you not to be afraid, and that you can make objects with your voice, uh, and all of this sort of stuff. And one of the reasons that they're so convincing to me is that on numerous occasions I have been given very specific information from these DMT entities that actually turned out to be true. One example is that I was my partner was pregnant, and we were running out of money. I hadn't told anyone though, so it's not like I put out a distress signal. And I smoked a little bit of DMT, and as the vision was fading, it's like a circle closing, like the old Bugs Bunny cartoons, and sometimes that pig would stick his head through and beep beep beep. That's all, folks, right? Kind of like that. It's this mantis stuck its head through the hole, and it said, this certain relative just sent you $1,000, and then when it disappeared, my phone beeped, and that relative had just sent me $1,000. So, and I have a number of experiences like that. So it's very difficult to dismiss these entities as a figment of our imagination because they seem to have access to information that we couldn't possibly know. I've received from ayahuasca information about a star system that was not known to astronomers until 5 days after the ceremony, and then it was published online. So it may have been known to them, but it was not published yet. And I was also told by ayahuasca Pachamama voice that my partner would have my babies before we were ever any inkling that we were going to be romantically involved, and it did not seem realistic at all that that would ever happen. And our son is asleep in the room next door. So the information that you get from these entities seems to be remarkably accurate and consistently accurate. On top of that, there's a lot of concern from a lot of people that maybe they're demonic and that they're no good, and certainly those jesters do seem kind of hostile and weird, but I think they're more of like the prankster variety of weird. And I have never encountered a DMT entity that has told me to do anything harmful or to hurt myself or hurt anyone else or even to do anything stupid. So whatever it is seems to be benign, but it is impossible. It's impossible. The visual aspect of it, there are DMT experience recreations online that are sort of good, but nothing really prepares you for what actually happens. It's one of those. It's one of the only things that no matter how much someone talks it up, you're still gonna have your expectations blown out of the water in general. Um, what I just remembered another really really remarkable DMT story. Um, Gosh, what was it? Oh, it was a really good one. So we talked about the precognition. And I experienced spontaneous remission of chronic fatigue symptoms after my first time smoking it. They just vanished, and I'm not going to explain the gematria aspect of this story, but a few years ago, studies were actually done where they confirmed that DMT shows promise for treating chronic fatigue syndrome, which there's really nothing you can do for it. And of course, it drove me to an opioid addiction dependency for a number of years. And chronic fatigue syndrome is absolutely horrible. Your life just sucks unless you take opiates. And DMT and ayahuasca oftentimes will just totally cause it to completely vanish. Um, so it's really remarkable. And I do think that it causes some kind of permanent change in consciousness. After you've smoked DMT, psilocybin mushrooms are not never quite the same, and it's not just me. I've seen people post online saying this as well. They kind of change, the character changes. So that's one of the things to consider if you enjoy magic mushrooms. I don't like it quite as much after I've had DMT. I kind of miss the old yeah, well, all psychedelics can help with any kind of addiction if they're used properly. Man, I'm bummed that I can't recall that other GMT tale. But yeah, so I think we've covered it all. Interdimensional hyperspace beings and shit. um Yeah, and it looks like we have the complete instructions for making food grade, um, our DMT from food grade chemicals in the chat. Of course, you guys shouldn't do that. Um, yeah, maybe I was going to talk about the entities. Oh, okay. Yeah. So check this out. My girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, a long time ago, but this girl that I was dating smoked DMT for the first time, and she had never read McKenna. So she had not encountered his description of the self-transforming machine elves, and what they do and what they look like and stuff. So she smokes the DMT for the first time. She comes back and she says, there were these like elf things that transformed, and they had these Rubik's cubes made of light, and they were like, look, this is how we do it. This is how we make dimensions. And then they were telling me to make an object with my voice, and I was like, what the fuck, have you read McKenna? And she's like, no, who? A long time ago. Terrence McKenna wasn't as famous when he was alive, right? So, um, but that just blew my mind, that she encountered these beings, that she described identically to the way that Terrence McKenna did, and they were doing the same things. And this is a normal experience. People encounter certain beings that are always talking about the same things. Brain surgery from the mantids is a very common experience where the mantises will open up the top of your skull and they'll manipulate the contents of your head. Um, yeah, I have another one like that though. Well, no, I don't. It's not my story. Uh, but there's a video you can check out from Shane Moss as well. That he has a really remarkable story like this, where he has this purple girlfriend that every time he smokes DMT, she's like there, and they'd hang out, and he felt like he had known her for like millions of years and all these different lives and all this. And so one time he said to her, "I need you to prove to me that this is real somehow. Like do something that shows me that you're not just in my head." So one day his friend comes over and he says, "Hey, you should try DMT." And the friend says, okay. So he sits down in the chair and Shane Moss gives him a hit of DMT. And after a few minutes, his friend says, Shane, there's this purple chick in here that wants me to tell you that she said hello. And so, he had just asked this DMT entity woman to, show him that she wasn't just in her head. And his friend, who he hadn't told about it, smokes DMT, and the purple woman tells his friend to say hi to Shane Moss for him. So, it's really it's really looking like these interdimensional beings may actually have their own objective existence. Sorry, I'm having to change hands a lot. I've been doing this forever. Um, a couple of hours now. And so, okay, so one more DMT tale. One of my favorite stories of all time regarding these compounds. There was a guy who was a nihilist and he was in a very bad place, and he came to me wanting to experience DMT. So, he's a nihilist. He doesn't believe in anything, no afterlife, nothing. And so he takes the 3 big hits of DMT and he comes back. And I said, so what happened? We are eternal. We are eternal consciousness. There's no such thing as death. And death was on his mind because his grandfather had just fallen out of a window and died. Here in Ecuador, there's no glass in the windows. So that's the kind of thing that is amazing about DMT as well. That a person can sit down in a chair and can have a completely different worldview and a completely different belief system in literally a matter of seconds, because there are a number of layers to it. For one thing, it's very difficult to imagine that our consciousness generated these visions. And so if it didn't come from you, where the hell is it coming from? And if you have not had DMT, you might not understand what I mean, but go and try it. And you only have 5 minutes to worry about allotting, maybe 15 minutes to make sure you totally can be back to baseline. Um, but it doesn't take very long, and I have scoured the internet looking for harm, instances where people have like lost their minds or run out into traffic or beat up their girlfriend. I can't find a single thing anywhere of anyone doing anything stupid on DMT. Mostly, I think, because you can't really do anything on DMT. Most people, you just fall over with your eyes closed, and when it wears off, you'll sit up. Um, just looking for questions, I guess. Okay, so does anyone have any questions for me? Because it is after 11 o'clock, which means I've been talking for 2 hours and 45 minutes. Um, Please do support us, by the way. Speaking of 3 hours of my time. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Also, if you guys need integration support or you need consultation, or if you want to come to Ecuador and have a plant medicine experience with either indigenous people in the Amazon or with me, that can always be arranged. So consider that. And I'm also available for all kinds of other stuff too. So check out my Patreon. Does DMT open your third eye? Yes, it absolutely does. I was always on the fence about, whether we have a third eye or what it would be for. And, I told you guys a little while ago that sometimes people can see through their pineal gland when they drink ayahuasca, which is activated, it's the DMT that is activating it. And also, it is not true that the pineal gland produces DMT. You can remove the pineal gland, and DMT is still generated by the brain. It has been found in the pineal gland of rats, but there's no evidence that it's actually generated there. Um, yeah, well, the Dogon tribe in Africa claim to have received cannabis from extraterrestrials, and they have an accurate star chart from seven star systems away. So that's weird. Um, but we were talking about DMT opening the third eye. Another aspect of DMT that's very common, or an effect of it, is what, oops, sorry, blocking the camera, Daniel Pinchbeck called an occult hangover, which I thought was a really good way to talk about it. Experiences of synchronicity and precognition and all of this sort of stuff generally increase a whole lot after smoking DMT, especially if you do it a few times. And it persists for a few weeks, and it's a very, very common experience. And so I think that what's going on is that when you build a bridge between the conscious and the subconscious mind, your what is available to your perceptual apparatus, right? The range is expanded, and so I don't think you have to be a vegan or a vegetarian. No, not at all. I don't think that has anything to do with even plant medicine, really. As I said, the Shuar would laugh at you if you told them that you needed to abstain from sex and red meat before you took ayahuasca. So it's just really a matter of who you ask. And there's a lot of industry bullshit that is associated with ayahuasca that is it's just you won't find any record of it any earlier than 1993, when this kind of all started to become commercialized. Um, but yeah, there are rods and cones in the pineal gland, and you can see through it when you drink ayahuasca sometimes. And also the capacities of consciousness that are associated with the pineal gland seem to increase. Your experience of them increases after contact with DMT. So, and the documentation of shaman actually doing things that are not supernatural, but that require, a third eye or, no, well, I mean, it depends. Is it a scary experience to open your third eye? I think that people that don't believe that there's anything more to reality than what a normal matrix mind experiences have a hard time with it. I mean, when I really started to experience awakened existence, I guess I don't know how to, like, really really expanded consciousness, a lot of the things that happened were difficult for me because it's so we are it's it's because we are programmed, we're conditioned from the time that we're born, to believe that a lot of these things are indications of a psychotic break. So synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, telepathy, hearing voices in your head that are actually accurate. All of those things can freak you out, but it's mostly because you've been conditioned to believe that they are indicators that you're experiencing a psychotic break, and they can be. So this is why, in traditional shamanic cultures, we have, shamans, and in the mystery traditions, which is like white man shamanism, I guess. It really comes from Egypt. But you have someone with more experience that is guiding you, and so they're there to check your ego inflation. They're there to make sure that once you experience precognition a few times, for example, you start to think that every thought that you think is precognition. Everything that you want to think, we call it wish demons, right? So there are difficulties that come with expanding your consciousness, and hearing a voice in your head is no accomplishment, but figuring out when it's telling the truth is the trick, right? So it is potentially dangerous if you lose your bearings, if you are unable to balance open-mindedness and skepticism. And there are certain guide points that you can follow. The mistake that a magician makes is to think that his magic can do more for him than it can. And I'm sure you've seen the scene in Fantasia where Mickey Mouse is trying to use his the sorcerer's magic to do all of his chores, and he ends up with the army of mops making a crazy mess and almost drowning and all this stuff. And so it's a fitting analogy that when you expand your consciousness, you're kind of like Mickey Mouse in that scene if you have no one to guide you. And so you have to remember that you will never do anything and you will never experience anything that overrides natural law. That's not what expanded consciousness does, and that's not what magic does. All it is that you are using more of your brain, and you are also using more subtle, or you're perceiving a more subtle dimension of reality. But you're not going to override natural law or do anything impossible. And remembering just that much can kind of help protect you from really going off the deep end. Man, so I've mostly just been a mouth this whole time, huh? I thought that I thought that the top of my screen was just cut off, but that's actually where my face has been. Um, Obviously, I'm getting a bit delirious, but I feel like the phone only has like 10% battery left. So if you guys have any more questions, I'll do my best with them. I know I didn't talk too much about Datura, but I would discourage anyone from using it because it is extremely dangerous. Datura stramonium is the fourth most toxic plant in the world, and the visions that it causes are true hallucinations, which means that you cannot distinguish them from reality. Whereas, with the kind of hallucinations you have with psilocybin, LSD, DMT, they're very obviously not real in the sense that the IRS is real. Um, so the Datura is much more is much more dangerous than any of the rest of these plants. Yeah, the repeating numbers thing is a weird one, huh? And what you'll notice is that you see these certain strings of numbers that will correspond with different internal processes, right? Moods and thoughts and sort of subjects. And I experienced this before it was like something that was huge on the internet. I didn't use the internet in 2011, as hard to believe as that may be. I hadn't started using it a lot yet. I didn't grow up with a computer in my house, and I never had a phone. And I've just when I say that I've lived my life outside of society, I'm not trying to be edgy and cool. It really is true. And it hurts me. It's not all fun and games because I didn't have good enough internet security a while back, and we lost all our money to a hack because I didn't understand about passwords and stuff. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but technology is relatively new to me. Point being, I wasn't on the internet much at that point, anyways. Um, but after I had all of those experiences where, we were seeing these numbers line up at certain times, and it was like this whole group of my friend, what you're describing. Uh, I saw a video recently of Maynard James Keenan from Tool in like 1992, telling an interviewer that, when people first start to expand their consciousness, when they start eating mushrooms in college or whatever, they will start to notice one of the first things that will happen is that you'll start to notice these strings of numbers. Another one is 1111. It's it's a glyph of symmetry, really, and symmetry is an essential uh, part of a real metaphysical model. Understanding the symmetry in the physical universe and how our consciousness relates to that is really kind of the secret behind 1111. It, two sets of one with a line through between them. You know what I mean? It's there. It's symmetry, and it's the four elements, and it's a lot of things. But the most important thing is the symmetry. And one of the things that it's representing is that the 11, one of the 11s is your internal experience, and the 11 on the other side is your external experience. And so when you have bridged the gap between the subconscious and the conscious mind, you'll start to notice this 1111 all the time. And I made all these videos about it already, and I actually managed to capture an 1111 moment in a video of mine called the Phoenix Process. Click on 1111 minute marker and you'll see what I mean. It's pretty remarkable, and you could accuse me of editing, but I think if you look at the whole video, it's kind of ridiculous. It was videoed in 4 different places, out of sequence, and then jumbled together afterwards, right? So it would have been extremely difficult to do. And I don't even do the editing for those videos. So then you would have to also accuse me of conspiring to put a bunch of time into deceiving people for a video that's got like 200 views or something. So, you know what I mean? It's not fake. And a little bit after that, in the video, it happens again where I'm describing a type of meditation where you freeze an image in your mind. And when I'm talking about it, the video glitches out and my face freezes. So, so yeah, the 1111 experiences and psychedelics and all of that kind of synchronicity. Carl Jung's theory of synchronicity was basically that what I'm saying, that once you have established this bridge between the conscious and the subconscious mind, you start to perceive these like meaningful and really, really highly improbable coincidences on a regular basis. And it's due to that connection with our subconscious mind. And uh, so again, going back to the glyph of symmetry that is 1111, what you're experiencing is the symmetry between your internal world and the external world, because it is symmetry that gives us order. Uh, and since we have order in our internal world and external world, we have symmetry in both places, but they actually correspond to each other and have relationships. And that's a big part of what the experience of awakening and expanding your consciousness is really about. About, having these with the universe in the sense that there are communications happening. And, even Einstein noticed synchronicity, and he said that, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And this is kind of what he was referring to. And so, that's one of the things I think people really need to understand about psychedelics that kind of causes some problems. People think that it's just something that you have this experience and then you go back to your normal consciousness. It's not. It's like the blue pill in the Matrix. There is more to reality than just the deterministic, mechanistic material. In my experience, not a whole hell of a lot more, and most of it's very subtle, but there is indeed more. And when we open ourselves up to those dimensions of experience, it's very enriching. It changes us, and the change can kind of be summarized by saying that it just sort of constrains our will to be in homeostasis with the universal will. We are more inclined to live for the collective more and less solely for our own individual egoic purposes. And it is uh, our natural state. This is what really the Garden of Eden is kind of referring to. That our detached, selfish, aggressive, all of those kind of tendencies are not natural. They are the product of exposure and living in a very toxic and sick society. Aldous Huxley made the observation 70 or 80 years ago that normal people, what we call normal people, are actually extremely mentally ill because they're well adjusted to a completely insane and toxic system. And so I cannot hold this camera up anymore. Um, 3 hours almost. So please do support us if you can. I will keep making videos, and we will work together to try to affect some meaningful change in the world. That's really my goal. And also to try to empower people that are empowering the right people. We're down here working with indigenous people, indigenous communities, trying to help them out, working with the Warani because they don't have ayahuasca tourism, and we need your support to continue to do all that, especially after getting hacked and having all of our money stolen a few weeks ago. So there are options for supporting in the description. My Patreon, you can find options for different tiers to have Zoom time for integration support or training in ritual magic or whatever it is that I can help you with. You just let me know. And thank you so much for spending this time with me. And we'll do it again very soon.